النزاع الدائر في كشمير ما هو وما هي خلفياته ومن يتحمل تبعات هذا النزاع وماذا يقول سكان كشمير عن هذا الصراع؟ الأزمة الكشميرية من الداخل. معكم زينب صفار، تابعونا.
هو باحث هندي في الاقتصاد وعلم الاجتماع وأحد الناشطين في الحملة المناهضة للرقابة في الهند. هو الكشميري سانجي الذي أخرج العديد من الأفلام الوثائقية في دول ومجتمعات عديدة حازت على جوائز عالمية كفيلم في الغابة جسر معلق الحائز على جائزة اللوتس الذهبية لأحسن فيلم وثائقي عام 99. كيف نحتفي بالحرية أو جشن أزادي بالأردية هو وثائقي كتبه وأخرجه عام 2007. فيلم أثار عاصفة في الهند ومنع من العرض في صالات وجامعات عديدة، وذلك بضغط من بعض الأطراف الرسمية والحزبية غير الراضية عن الوقائع الكشميرية التي يعرضها ويتطرق إليها فموضوع كشمير خط أحمر في الهند. الفيلم يؤرخ 18 عاما من النزاع المسلح بين الهند وباكستان في كشمير، والذي تخللته 3 حروب عام 47 و65 و99 كانت حصيلتها 60,000 قتيل و7,000 مفقود وعشرات المقابر التي تغص بالشهداء. هي البقعة الأكثر كثافة بالمسلحين الذين يصل عددهم إلى أكثر من 500,000 عسكري. كيف نحتفي بالحرية يتقفى الآثار النفسية على مدى عقدين من الزمن على الكشميريين الذين عانوا الفقدان والخسارة لسنوات وما زالوا، وذلك في نضالهم من أجل الحرية وتقرير المصير. هو فيلم يعتمد على المشاهد الحية وأرشيف فريد وسرد نثري وشعري يحاول الكاتب من خلاله فهم مكامن مشاعر الكشميريين التواقين إلى الحرية. إنه نظرة مستفزة للديمقراطية الهندية وتصوير للعطش الرهيب للحرية وللانتفاضة الجديدة في كشمير.
Mr. Sanjay Kak, Indian documentary filmmaker and author of Until My Freedom Has Come, the new Intifada in Kashmir. Welcome to The Inside and welcome at Al Mayadeen TV. Sir, this book carries a title which is a bit incendiary. What can you tell us about that?
I don't know if people are aware of the fact that between 2008 and 2010, we had very, very widespread and serious kind of disturbances in Kashmir. They were distinct because unlike the 15 years prior to that or the 17 years prior to that, the disturbances did not come out of an armed insurrection or an armed militancy. But these were disturbances where masses of people came out onto the street. And it actually changed the way in which most Indians perceived the problem in Kashmir. Because until now, until 2008, it had become kind of convenient for Indians to think that what was going on in Kashmir was simply a story of an armed militancy, which was Islamic in nature, which was supported by Pakistan. And that
maybe because the highest percentage of the people of Kashmir are Muslims.
Well, Kashmir has a 95% Muslim population. So it's natural that if you have a political uprising, it will have a Muslim character, it will have an Islamic character, but that does not necessarily make it an Islamist uprising. You know, there is a difference between the two. And I think the uprising that took place on the streets between 2008 and 2010 what it did was that it brought back the politics into our understanding, and it affected the international media as well. You know, for the first time people said, oh, so it's not simply a matter of a dispute over a piece of land between India and Pakistan. Kashmir is a very small place, you know, you have to understand that, you know, if you get into a car, in half a day you'll have crossed from one end to the other. And yet, for 70 years, India and Pakistan have been at loggerheads over it.
They have waged at least three wars over Kashmir.
And it is the principal bone of contention between the two. So when we called that book The New Intifada in Kashmir, it was because almost after 20 years, 20 years in which people had taken to the gun and kind of withdrawn from it, not defeated by anybody, but strategically they had shifted. It was, in a sense, like an intifada, a new intifada in Kashmir.
Because, you know, when you say the word intifada, we directly relate it to occupied Palestine.
You know, I think it's something that people forget, that on the street in Kashmir, and I recall this myself, you know, in 89 and 90, the events in Palestine had a very significant effect on what was going on in Kashmir. I think that because around the early 90s is also the earliest times that we started seeing images on television of the Intifada in Palestine. They did actually spark off something here. So it's not entirely, it's not just a word that we are using. You know, I think it's important to point out that even now, young people in Kashmir, I mean young people who read, they follow events in Palestine and in the Middle East perhaps more closely than they follow events in the mainstream of India. So there is a real interest in Kashmir in what goes on in that part of the world.
Right. Your book came just now, but before that book you had this documentary, Jasn-e-Azadi, which is how to celebrate freedom. It also sparked and stirred a storm. And it was even stopped from screening at certain film festivals.
You know, I think the sensitivity about Kashmir in India is so extreme that for a very long time it was really almost impossible to have a real conversation about Kashmir. It's not only the state. It's not only the state which is reluctant to give the space for a real discussion on Kashmir. Even so-called progressive liberal Indians, the one thing about which they are illiberal and conservative is Kashmir. You know, it's sort of, I think that it tells you something about how deep-rooted this extremely nationalistic feeling is in India, that they're willing to debate and argue about everything, but on Kashmir,
but not on Kashmir.
Not on Kashmir, you know. So my film was a response to that silence, you know. I think it's important to point out that I myself am a Kashmiri. I come from, I'm not a Muslim, I come from the Kashmiri Pandits, as they are called, Kashmiri Hindus.
The Hindus.
And I went back in 2003 after a very long time, and I was astounded by how little I knew about what was going on there. And you know, as a Kashmiri living in Delhi and connected to the media, it should have been easy for me to follow what was going on there. But when I returned to Kashmir, I realized that the silence is so total in our understanding of Kashmir.
Why is it this case? I mean, is it because Kashmir is a red line, nobody has to raise it, nobody has to approach it?
I think both countries involved, India and Pakistan, are constructed in some terrible sort of way around the idea of Kashmir. In Pakistan, it's intolerable for the Pakistani state to imagine that there is a Muslim majority province which is not a part of Pakistan, and we are talking about the partition of the subcontinent in 1947. And on the Indian side, it's like a trophy that, you know, we are a secular country, see, here's a Muslim majority state and it's part of us, you know. So I think ascertaining what it is that the people of Kashmir want has always been a taboo subject, you know, from 1952 onwards. You know, it's been something that you don't really want to know what's going on in Kashmir, you know. And because of the armed militancy which came up in 1990, it was a kind of justification that, oh, but you know, it's not important to listen to what the Kashmiris are saying.
Is this what you disclosed in your documentary?
My film is not, it's not a historic or a chronological account, but it's really about the feelings. What does it feel like to be a Kashmiri?
The humanitarian aspect.
Yes, and also that the Kashmiris, the urge for azadi, the word freedom, is a very old one. You know, Kashmiris will invoke a history which is of subjugation, which is 500 years old. So it's not something trivial, it's not something that they've just been asking for the last 20 years, or something that they've just been speaking of for 50 years or 70 years. There's a long history of colonization.
Why was it banned and stopped at certain places from screening, and how did you react to this?
See, when I was making the film, it was quite clear to me that this was not going to be easy to show this film in India, you know. And I don't know if you're aware of the fact, but in India, to show a film, you need a censor certificate, which means you submit it to the government and then they give you a censor certificate. I chose to not apply for a censor certificate. I have been involved in a campaign against censorship in India, so as part of that, I did not. I have to say that there were screenings which were stopped, sometimes by the police, sometimes by mobs, but in all those cases, it was not as if people had a problem with seeing the film. You know, this is the old thing that somebody would go, two people will go and lodge a complaint and the police will come and stop a screening.
Right.
And I think what they were afraid of was not necessarily just my film, but the conversation around it. You know, I
the
think,
debate it provokes.
Yes. I think that I wasn't making a news documentary. I was making a long film. It's 2 hours and 19 minutes long. It's complex, it's ambiguous, and those kinds of films create conversations. So I think that that was principally the reason why the film became contentious. But I also have to say, and this is the wonderful thing about this country, is that you know, I have shown that film more widely than I have shown any other film that I have ever made. What is so interesting about it is that, you know, the most unexpected locations and the most unexpected audiences really do want to know. And let me tell you what they're most interested in. They are interested in Kashmir and they are interested in its significance, but they're also very, very interested in the militarization of Kashmir. Because I think that as a country that sees itself as a democracy, there is nothing more worrying than the stories of what prolonged militarization does to a place.
What do you mean here by militarization?
Kashmir is a small valley, as I told you. You can drive across it in less than half a day, and yet there are more than 500,000 soldiers there. You know, every aspect of daily
And here
life.
you are blaming them for the killings, for example, and for the incidents, for the insecurity that is taking place in
No,
Kashmir.
I believe this is not a special characteristic of the military in Kashmir. You know, I believe whether you have the US Army in Vietnam, or you have it in Afghanistan, or you have it in Iraq, when you place large amounts of military soldiers, the most disciplined armies will end up doing the most terrible things.
Right.
This week, we have had a report by a civil society group come out called Alleged Perpetrators, where they look very carefully at over 200 cases, which are, these are not allegations, okay? These are cases that have been filed with the police. These are cases which have been investigated. These are cases sometimes that have gone to court. These are cases in which the perpetrators, the people who have committed crimes, their names and everything is there. And yet not in one of those cases has there been any attempt to give justice to the people.
So complete impunity
That's what the title of the report is. You know, it talks about impunity.
However, sir, the former Army Chief General V.K. Singh had said at an open press conference that 95% of the allegations of the Indian Army's alleged atrocities had been investigated and found to be false.
You know, I don't think you can be judge and jury at the same time. You know, you can't be the accused and the judge and the jury and the hangman and everything. I don't think I'm willing to take the word of the Chief of the Army Staff.
Right.
I think that it needs to be if the government of India really has nothing to hide in Kashmir, then I think they should be more open to
and expose what's really going on.
Exactly. This report that I'm talking to you about lists 250 cases, of which at least 200 pertain to army officers. You know, I don't think that any army chief would be able to make the kind of statement that you just read out. So, we don't have to.
Right, Mr. Sanjay Kak, more about Kashmir, but we have to stop now for a short break. A short break, and we'll be back with Mr. Sanjay Kak, Indian documentary filmmaker. Stay tuned. Welcome back to The Inside with Mr. Sanjay Kak, Indian documentary filmmaker. Welcome back, sir. As far as freedom of expression is concerned, how far is it at stake in India?
You know, I think freedom of expression is a daily battle. I think that it would be very foolish to imagine that anywhere in the world that the right to express yourself is something that you can take for granted. I think that as a filmmaker, as a documentary filmmaker who works in India, I consider it a given that every time I do something, every time I make a film, that somebody will make it difficult for me to circulate my work. You know, so that's a given. Having said that,
not to forget the attacks against you.
Those will happen. You know, I think that we are in some senses fortunate because we don't grow up with the kinds of protections that, say, media practitioners in the rest of the world grow up with, especially in the West, where they kind of assume that they are free. Actually, they're probably less free than we are. You know, I believe that in the West, the grip of capitalism on their artistic and creative practice is so extreme that they are not really free either. But we here take it upon ourselves that every day is going to be a struggle. Now, once you accept that,
for an audience outside India, how can you describe the daily life pursued by the Kashmiris in Kashmir? Why are they in continuous call for azadi or freedom? And why do they feel that they are alienated one way or another?
I think there are, one should make a distinction. I think that if you were a Kashmiri living in a city, like say the city of Srinagar, which is the capital city of Kashmir, your life would not be, in the present, in 2012, it would not be terribly affected by the presence of the security forces. All right, the bunkers on the street, the policing, the policemen with guns every 20 feet, all that which was a feature of the last 5-6 years has now slowly gone down, and this is what people call normalization, right? But if you go to the countryside, nothing has changed. So if I was a villager, I'll give you an example. Even now, if I'm in a remote village and I have to have a marriage in my house, I have to go and ask the army unit nearby.
You need to report.
I need to report. If I am traveling in a bus from my village to the city, it's still possible that it will be stopped maybe a dozen times, that you will have to get down, you'll have to show your identity cards, you'll have to be frisked, you'll have to be checked. So I think that in that sense, the experience of daily life of a citizen in rural Kashmir is not very different from that in the occupied territories. And now what has happened is that, you know, I referred earlier in this conversation to the disturbances of 2008 and 2009 and 2010. The bulk of the people who came out in those protests were very young people. They were 17, 18, 19, 20. The surveillance on their lives is so extreme. Literally every one of those boys has been videoed. They have been identified. They have to report to the police stations. Their parents have to report to the police stations.
But they say also that there are certain reports that indicate that those, the youth, let's say in Kashmir, it's because of unemployment. They resort to certain kind of tactics. They are being hired by extremist Islam, call them whatever, and they are engaged in this action.
Yeah, I think it's convenient for people to look at it like that. And undeniably, if you have 100 protesters on the street, they will have the same proportion of unemployed and employed and engineers and doctors in it as any population anywhere. So, you know, I think that this story of unemployment being the primary engine for the disaffection in Kashmir is unfortunately not a very useful one, because every time anybody in a significant leadership role has been arrested, they have invariably turned out not to be unemployed louts. They have turned out to be engineers and you know, qualified people. So I think this is just a, you know, this has increasingly become for any kind of political disaffection, the belief that if you pour money into a region, that will solve all your problems. I mean, by that reckoning, the Americans should have triumphed in Afghanistan. They should have triumphed in Iraq. The billions of dollars that they have poured into buying people. So I don't think that this is a very fruitful way of looking at it.
However, well-informed sources said that Wahhabi trend of Islam paid for terrorism. It has inflicted some more casualties on the Kashmiri people than any other citizens, and no human rights campaigners have criticized the atrocities of Wahhabi, as they call them, extreme Islam terrorism on the people of Kashmir.
I think a statement of this kind can only be made by somebody who is totally ignorant of the history of Kashmir. I think that if we just look at the years since 1990, when the armed militancy first came out, the militancy was led initially by the JKLF, the Jammu Kashmir Liberation Front, which was an avowedly secular force. You know, they were not Islamists, although they were Muslims, most of them. It's a different matter that they were, what the demands they were making and the sort of the political argument that they were making was crushed with terrible ferocity by the Indian state. And inevitably, out of that came a more hardline Islamic faction, which was supported by Pakistan. So I'm not saying that in Kashmiri society there is not the tussle between a more hardline Islam and another way of looking at the world. There is a presence of Wahhabi Islam, but it's very, very disconnected from politics.
Allow me here to ask you about Sheikh Abdullah. To what extent does he bear responsibility for the situation in Kashmir?
You know, Sheikh Abdullah is an extremely important figure, principally because he led a very, very important movement, an anti-feudal movement. You know, Kashmir, when it had a king who ruled it, was a very feudal society, and the condition of the peasantry, who were almost entirely Muslim, was terrible, terrible.
Right.
And Sheikh Abdullah from 1932 onwards led a very, very important anti-feudal movement. And that is what made him what they called Sher-e-Kashmir, the Lion of Kashmir. In 1947, when the partition of India was to happen, he did not see it appropriate for Kashmir, even though it was a Muslim majority province, to be part of Pakistan. And he wanted time to think about what would be the shape of a future Kashmir. And at that time, he signed, he came to an agreement with the Indian government. We have to remember that from 1952 he was in jail for 17 years, you know. He was still the Lion of Kashmir. When he came out and he came to an arrangement with the Indian state, and that arrangement was a renege. He reneged, he went back on the position that he had fought for. That is when the people of Kashmir completely broke with him, in a sense. So we have, in my mind, he's also quite a tragic figure, because here's a man who has led a very important anti-feudal movement for 15, 16, 17 years. Here's a man who spends 17 years in prison, and then because he succumbs, his people, and today his grave in Srinagar has to be protected by the police.
Sanjay, will dividing a state or the state in Kashmir help?
I don't think the discussion is about dividing a state.
What do the people really want?
I think what people want is what they say. And what they say on the street is, Hum kya chahte azadi. What do we want? Freedom.
Freedom.
What does freedom want? What does it mean? Now that's a question. And I don't think you or I can decide on behalf of the people.
You as a Kashmiri, what do you want?
I want Kashmir to be a democracy in which the people will decide for themselves how they want their future to be. Do they want that future to be with India? Do they want that future to be with Pakistan? Do they want that future to be independent? After all, Europe is full of examples of even more complicated arrangements, you know. So I think that Kashmir is not an intractable problem. I think Kashmir is a failure of our imaginations.
Right.
I think both in India and in Pakistan and elsewhere in the world, we are so used to borders and armies and checkposts. I mean, I must tell you something very important. Kashmir sits in a very, very unique place. If you look at a map of the world, it sits at the tri-junction of three major civilizational pushes. You know, you have Tibet to the east,
yes.
and you have Buddhist, the faith. From the south, you have India, and you have essentially Hinduism.
Yes, and you have
And to the
Pakistan.
west, you have you have Islam, you know.
Yeah.
And for that reason, this place could be a very, very interesting and powerful.
Multi-ethnic.
It could, and it is.
Multicultural.
That's what makes it so interesting and valuable.
Right.
But instead of that, we all see it as a piece of land over which you fight.
Over.
You fight over. And I think that what it really shows is that how our political imaginations have been so blunted that we are unable to see hope, you know. And I think, to me, the struggle in Kashmir is really about a struggle of the imagination. That's what I support.
But for the sake of freedom, we should always carry hope inside ourselves.
Absolutely.
Indian documentary filmmaker Mr. Sanjay Kak, thanks a million for this unique interview.
Thank you very much, Zainab.
You're most welcome. إذا لقاء جديد مع ضيف جديد وقضية جديدة ودائما من الداخل. للمزيد من التواصل theinside@almayadeen.net. إذا theinside@almayadeen.net. من حسين نصار، بسام خطار، ومني زينب الصفار. إلى اللقاء.